So before we begin taking our look at what Spotify can do for us, let's take a quick look through the history of how radio stations have programmed and picked the right new music. Going back to the very beginning when radio stations were using song sales, what did we learn from song sales back when that was radio's only way of judging new music? How many new people bought a song that they wanted to hear? Well, what it doesn't tell us, however, is how long did people keep listening to that song once they bought it? And what we learned from song sales, and this is true from when people bought songs in the 1960s on 45s, or back when they bought them on iTunes just a few years ago, is that the top 10 best-selling songs are typically between 1 and 12 weeks old. And if you go back to radio before the 70s, you'll typically find that currents moved to gold categories after about 12 weeks at the most. Then the next innovation that came along was call out in the 1970s, and call out measures which songs listeners know and love, or maybe merely just like, or know and hate, or know and have gotten sick of hearing. But what it doesn't tell us is anything about songs that we don't test. Call out research is only as good as the test list that programmers put together. And what it taught us was that it takes listeners longer to get to know songs and to decide that they like them than it took the record buying public to buy them. And so the typical top 10 song in CHR call out is typically between 8 and 24 weeks old. So when call out was invented, it had the effect of slowing down rotations on hit radio. Not much changed until PPM came along, and boy, did it institute some changes, as we all know. Along with it, it brought M-Score, which measures which songs PPM panelists are more or less likely to be hearing when they switch away. But M-Score doesn't tell us anything at all about which songs they tuned into your radio station to hear in the first place. Well, what we learned from it, or what we at least thought we were learning from it, is that listeners are more likely to switch away during new songs and stick around for highly familiar songs. And so just when we were thinking that, you know what, listeners are tuning in for the tried and true, they don't want to discover new music, Shazam came out and became yet another resource that radio stations use. And what we learned, what Shazam tells us, is which songs people hear and want to know more information about it. They want to know what it is. But Shazam does not measure anything about songs that people already can identify because there's no need to do that. But what it taught us was that, contrary to what we may have assumed from M-Score, that listeners really are curious about new songs and they want to know the artist and title of them. Well, now we have yet another new tool in our arsenal by using the data from streaming and on-demand audio services, the biggest brand of which is Spotify. And Spotify gives the radio industry a free gift through these Spotify charts. What we're going to show you here is the same information that you can go and look at right now online through the Spotify charts, which shows you the top 200 songs globally or in a specific country. You can see what the top 200 songs are weekly or daily. And we specifically examined the total number of streams of the top 200 songs on Spotify in the United States each week from January 3rd, 2019 through August of 2019. And those are the same charts that you can look at right now at spotifycharts.com. The top 50 songs on the Billboard Radio Songs chart is something else we're going to compare so that you can see how Spotify streams compared to radio airplay. That's the same information that you can find at billboard.com, and it's the same information that's you'll find in Nielsen BDS. So, what can Spotify tell us? Well, what it measures is which songs people play the most when they're in control of their music. What it does not measure, however, is how many different Spotify users played a song, how often each Spotify user played that song, and what's the difference between those two? What do we mean by that? Well, imagine for a moment that we have 10 different Spotify users, and they like a song, they like the same song, so each of them plays it 10 times. Well, for Spotify, that counts as 10 plays. For labels, that counts as 10 royalty payments. And for radio, that counts as 10 different people liking the song. Now, in contrast, let's imagine we have one guy with Spotify who plays a song 10 times in the course of a day. He likes it so much. For Spotify, that also means 10 plays. For the labels, that also means 10 royalty payments. But for radio, that only means one person who likes this song. Why is that distinction important? Well, because if you have a small number of people who play a song over and over and over again, it can look the same as a song that a lot of people like. This is how Baby Shark became a top 40 hit. Appeals to a relatively small demographic, but that demographic is known for playing songs they love over and over and over and over again. Nice work there, toddlers. We also don't know who is playing a song because the Spotify charts don't give us specific demographic information for each song. We do know that Spotify users in general tend to be younger. They tend to be more likely to be from urban areas than rural areas. They tend to be more into hip hop than some other genres. But we don't know exactly who is driving the appeal of the song. And we also don't know who hates a song, because the reality is if you don't like a song, you just don't play it on Spotify. And finally, we don't know how long someone has listened to a song. And what do we mean by that? Well, what officially counts as a Spotify stream? If somebody plays a song for 30 seconds or longer, that officially counts as a stream. It counts as a play on the charts. It counts as a royalty payments to the label. If someone samples it for less than 30 seconds, it doesn't count. But if someone's checking out a song and they play it for 45 seconds, then it does count as a play. So they don't tell us if someone listens all the way through or just listens for the minimum 30 seconds. So what can Spotify teach us? Well, let's dig in and find out together. So the first question we want to answer is, do listeners spend more time listening to music based on what songs are out? And this is a question programmers have asked about whether their ratings are going to be dependent on a bad batch of music or a really exciting batch of music. Well, let's look at it granularly as we can with Spotify data to find out. We're going to look at the total weekly streams for all of the top 200 songs in the US from January to August. And you'll see that there are some peaks and valleys in terms of how much music listeners are playing from week to week. On average, the top 200 songs get 583 million streams per week, but that can vary. It can go as high as 716 million streams a week or as low as 536 million streams per week. What accounts for these differences? Well, at this high point that we have comes when Ariana Grande released her album in early 2019 and owned spots 1 through number 9 of the top 10 songs on Spotify that particular week. So a lot of people spending time consuming Ariana Grande's new music. The second point came when Billie Eilish owned 7 out of the top 10 when she released her album. And the third came when the Billie Ray Cyrus remix of Old Town Road came out at number 1, with the original version still being at number 2. The low point in terms of total streaming came from when Drake and Rick Ross's Money in the Grave was number 1. And it wasn't that that song wasn't performing particularly well at that point. People were checking it out, but it wasn't part of a bigger project that got released. Let's take a look now at how much variation there is in streaming on a weekly basis for the number 1 song on Spotify, and there is a lot of it. On a typical week, 14 million streams will occur for the number 1 song on Spotify. And again, that's not 14 million people playing it. It could be 14 million people playing the song once. It could be 1.4 million people playing the song 10 times. We don't have that information, but overall it counts for 14 million plays on average for the number 1 song. But that varies a lot. In fact, it can double on some weeks to as high as 28 million streams per week, or dip down to 9 million streams per week. So what accounts for these peaks and valleys and how many plays the number 1 song gets? Well, the big peak came when Ariana Grande released 7 Rings, and it was number 1 on debut. The next peak came when Ariana Grande released Break Up With Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored, and it became number 1. The fourth biggest peak became when Billie Eilish's Bad Guy released, and it was number 1. However, our trough also came when Billie Eilish's Bad Guy was number 1 again. So even though the song weeks later was getting fewer streams, there wasn't anything new out that was more compelling. So Bad Guy got to be number 1 again. And our third highest point came when Old Town Road was number 1 with the Billie Ray Cyrus remix, while the original was still number 2. So looking at Spotify streams and how they vary from week to week, we can say, yes, consumers consume more music at certain times, particularly when a hot new artist releases a new album or when a big artist releases a new highly anticipated song. That does generate more listening to music. Now for our next question, is Spotify replacing record stores or radio stations? Now, this is more than just some sort of hypothetical question like we used to ask about is Pandora radio or not. We're really looking at, do people use Spotify like they would use a record store, or do they use it like they would use a radio station? Well, first, let's take a look at the vintage distribution of the typical top 10 song on radio from January to August 2019, the same period of time we're examining on Spotify. And as we typically see in radio, it takes time for listeners to get to know a song. As it tests better, more radio stations add it. And that's why we see that the majority of the top 10 songs on radio are between 9 and 20 weeks old. And that's largely driven by what they get in their new music research. When we took an analysis of CHR Callout a few years ago, we found that 50% of the top 10 songs in CHR Callout are also between 9 and 24 weeks old. There are some songs that are older than that continue testing well in Callout, but you don't see that reflected in Airplay, of course, because programmers wisely generally move those songs to recurrent categories. So how does the radio pattern compare to Spotify? Well, it looks very different. Here's the distribution for the top 10 songs on Spotify from January to August. And as you see that the longer something is on, the less likely it is to remain in the top 10. In fact, 81% of the top 10 songs on Spotify are between 1 and 12 weeks old. Now, wait a minute, you're thinking this pattern is completely different than radio. What in the heck are we doing here? Spotify really is changing the game for everything. But wait a minute, remember that we saw that figure 1 to 12 weeks old earlier in this presentation? We saw it when we looked at song sales data, and that's because this Spotify curve, this distribution of the top 10 songs with really being strong on the first week and then lessening each week thereafter, looks a whole lot like the vintage distribution of the top 10 biggest songs that people buy. In particular, we're looking here at an analysis we did a few years ago of the top 10 songs that people paid to download digitally on services like iTunes. And we found that 55% of the top 10 songs people paid to download are also between 1 and 12 weeks old. So what we're seeing here is that Spotify, the usage of it looks a lot more like a music sales pattern. In other words, think about when you buy a new album. You'd rush out to get it if it was coming from your favorite artist. You'd take it home, you'd put it on the turntable or the CD player, and you'd sample every track. Well, in 2019, people are still doing that, but instead of having to go down to the record bar at the mall, they're now able to pull out their phone and do it on Spotify. And so we're seeing that same pattern where people are sampling things right when they come out. And that's a pattern that resembles record stores. And that's why we say Spotify is replacing record stores, not radio. So is Spotify changing new music consumption patterns? And you might say by what we just looked at, well, no, not really. But the more important question for us is, does radio need to change our pattern of how we expose music? So let's look at some individual songs to get a sense of that. Here are all the #1 songs during the time period we examined on Spotify. And let's compare those to the #1 songs on US radio during that same time frame according to the Billboard Radio Songs chart. Now you'll notice two things right away. One, you'll notice that there's higher, faster turnover on Spotify. Songs are #1 for a shorter period of time and then quickly replaced by other songs. But the other thing you will notice is that there is a longer time for those songs that are #1 on both. It takes longer for the song to become #1 on radio than it does on Spotify. For example, here's Seven Rings, here's Jonas Brothers' Sucker. But remember what we just looked at. For Spotify, people are using it like a record store, and when artists have a new project come out or have a new song come out, their fans rush to Spotify to stream it, and that's why there's a lot of interest on the front end. Whereas for the broader radio audience, and keep in mind there are a lot more people listening to radio than are using Spotify even in 2019, it takes time for that broader audience to get to know the song as radio exposes it, and as people get to know it and decide that they like it, radio moves it from lesser categories up to power current categories. And so typically, while the average top 10 song on Spotify is about almost 9 weeks old, the typical song on radio is 16.5 weeks old before it reaches its peak. So in order for radio to be late on adding a song, as some pundits have claimed, you shouldn't look at this pattern and say that radio is late, because really, radio started playing a song right at the same moment that it was on Spotify. What would indicate that radio was late in playing a song is if the song had been top 10 on Spotify for weeks before radio even started touching. In other words, for radio to be late, we should look for this pattern. So with that in mind, let's dig in and look at some of the biggest songs from the biggest artists so far in 2019. And we're going to break these up into some different categories. And the first category we're going to look at is When was radio right on time with exposing a new song? And first, let's take a look at Ariana Grande. Ariana Grande released the big Thank You Next album early this in 2019, and the first song to come off of that was Seven Rings, the first song to be released in 2019, that is. Then she released her entire album, and right away, tons of streaming happened for Ariana Grande, people sampling pretty much every song on her new album, Thank You Next. The second week, people were still sampling every single song on the album, but significantly fewer streams than happened the week that it was released. And we see that happening in the third and fourth week. People are still sampling the whole project, but fewer and fewer plays each week for each song. And then one by one, we see that these album cuts are getting fewer and fewer streams to the point that they fall off of Spotify's top 200. We have the release of Monopoly with Victoria Monet, that adds to her streaming count. But then all the way as we go through till August, one by one, those album cuts fall off the top 200 to the point where the only two songs that have been released in 2019 that are still in the top 200 are songs that were also on the radio, Seven Rings and Break Up With Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored. Now, those were just the songs that were released in 2019. Let's scope out now and look at Ariana Grande's entire catalog to see what was on Spotify's top 200. And here we see that several other songs continue to remain in the top 200. And when she released Thank You Next, the streaming for many of them increased with that new project. Now, two of those songs actually were released with the album. Thank You Next was actually released as a single back in November 23rd of 2018. And Imagine was then released in December and was also featured on The Tonight Show during that time period. And this represents a new pattern that we are seeing with labels and Spotify. Instead of waiting for an entire album to be ready and releasing it all at once like we did in the olden days, artists are releasing songs one by one. And then when they've released enough of them, they then release the entire album. In some cases, the album's coming out, almost a year after the single first came out. But just to show you here, we're seeing that when the new album comes out, even songs that have been out for a while are getting more interest because of the new album. So let's look at individual songs. Let's look at Seven Rings. Debuts, as we mentioned, at number one, the highest debut of the time period we examined. It streams then fall, but it still remains among the top on Spotify. Ends up being top 10 for 10 weeks, ends up being top 30 for 22 weeks, and even after it falls out of the top 30, it continues to get a healthy dose of streaming week after week after week. This is what a big hit on Spotify looks like typically. It debuts super big, but it remains fairly big even as streams fall off week after week. Now let's compare that to radio airplay for Ariana Grande's Seven Rings. Here's the chart position for Spotify. And let's compare that to the chart position for radio. Now, as we discussed, we're not looking to measure whether radio was powering the song at the same time that Spotify was because they're different consumption patterns. What we're looking is, did radio act on that song in a timely manner? And for Seven Rings, absolutely yes. Airplay and streaming started simultaneously for that song. It went top 10 in airplay in only 2 weeks. Remember, the typical song would take about 8 weeks. And its peak airplay occurred 10 weeks after its debut. We would typically expect that to be about 16 or 17 weeks for most songs on the radio. So radio was clearly right on time. Similar story for Break Up With Your Girlfriend, I'm Bored. It wasn't as big of a hit. It was top 10 for 7 weeks, top 30 for 10 weeks, and fell off a little bit faster, but still a pretty substantial hit. Comparing the Spotify chart position to the radio chart position, radio was a couple weeks late on starting to spin it, probably because we were already spinning Seven Rings. But once the airplay started, it went top 10 in airplay after only 9 weeks. And as it streams diminished for it on Spotify, radio moved it to recurrent. So again, I would say that we were right on time for this Ariana Grande track as well. Similar pattern for Jonas Brothers' Sucker. You see that it was top 10 for 5 weeks, top 30 for 17 weeks. And radio, as we noted with the Ariana Grande songs, started it right on time. It only took 4 weeks for the Sucker to become top 10 in airplay nationwide, and it only took 6 weeks after its debut for radio airplay to peak. Similar story with Shawn Mendes' Señorita, which also radio, it only took 5 weeks for that song to go top 10 in airplay. So these are examples of songs that were big on Spotify, they were big on radio, and radio was right on time to add them. And there were other songs, however, when radio was right to say, no thanks, we're going to pass on that one. such as some of the album tracks. Let's look at NASA from Ariana Grande. Pretty successful for an album track. It debuted at number 3 with about 15 million streams, which is stronger than some number ones, but it only stays top 10 for 1 week and only stays top 30 for 3 weeks. And then it declines, you'll notice, much more rapidly than the songs we looked at previously so far. So here is an example where people sampled it when the album was new, but ultimately this wasn't the song that people kept streaming week after week like we saw with the ones that were big hits on radio as well. That one might seem obvious to be an album track, but what about Logic featuring Eminem's Homicide? Also a strong debut, but as we saw with NASA, also a fairly quick decline. It only was top 10 for 2 weeks, only top 30 for 4 weeks. Still got streams, but fell pretty quickly after its debut. And so radio was right not to make that a big song for radio. There are, however, times when radio hung on too long. Let's look at Taylor Swift's Me. Strong debut at number 1, but only stayed top 10 for 3 weeks, only stayed top 30 for 5 weeks. And this song looks a lot like the last 2 songs we looked at that radio we concluded was right to pass on. But look what happened with Taylor Swift on the radio. Clearly, as you would expect with Taylor Swift, radio stations started playing it right away, but it was still top 10 in airplay 4 weeks after the streaming numbers on Me had tanked. Now, I presume a lot of stations were waiting, as we instruct them to do, to make sure that the call-out research really was not going to get any better on that song. But by looking at the Spotify numbers, programmers could have gotten an early heads up that no, that song really wasn't going to test any better as time went on. Now, not all is good news for radio. There are cases where radio is late to add a song that is a bona fide hit on Spotify. And let's take a look at Billie Eilish, one of the most talked about artists of 2019 for examples there. Billie Eilish released her album When We All Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? In late March of this year. The first song that she released in 2019 was Bury a Friend. She then released Wish You Were Gay. And then she released the entire album, and right away, pretty much every track on the album is a top 200, with the exception of that weird orthodontist visit track that she had on there. Similar with Ariana Grande, we see that in subsequent weeks, people are still sampling the entire album, but in fewer numbers than they were when it debuted. And then, as we saw with Ariana Grande, one by one, those album tracks fall out of the top 200 on Spotify. As we really focus in on the real hits that people continue to stream week after week. You'll then notice that on 7/18, the remix comes out with Justin Bieber. And then by the time we're into August, we really only have a handful of songs that are still top 200 for Billie Eilish. When we add in her entire catalog and see what songs are on the top 200, we notice that, just as we noticed with Ariana Grande, the release of the album boosts interests in a lot of her previous songs that had been released. And also, as we noticed with Ariana Grande, some of those songs were actually featured on the album, but had been released far before the album actually came out. Most notably, You Should See Me in a Crown was released in July of 2018, and When the Party's Over was released in October of 2018. But even though those songs had been out for a while, when the whole album came out, we saw a boost in interest in those songs. Now let's take a look at Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. This is one of the biggest songs on Spotify this year. Debuts at number 1, remains in the top 3 for weeks, even returning to number 1. And then notice this date, 7/18, July 18th. That's going to be really key when we look at another big song in 2019. At this point, Billie Eilish releases the remix with Justin Bieber. Spotify does not consider those the same song. Spotify counts those as different songs. So it would look like this remix is actually cannibalizing streams for the original version of Bad Guy. Billboard, however, considers them the same song. So when you add those streams together, you find that by releasing the remix, you boost the total streams for both versions of the song. And if that were the case, Billie Eilish would return to number 1 for 2 more weeks and still continue to get strong streaming for several weeks while the remix eventually fades out. Overall, Bad Guy was top 10 for 21 weeks, top 30 for 26 weeks on Spotify. Now, this is a case where radio wasn't quite as fast to embrace this song. There were some stations that did play it, but really it wasn't until the song had been on Spotify for 7 weeks that airplay was significant enough for it to start showing up on the radio songs chart. and it didn't reach peak airplay until 19 weeks after it peaked on Spotify. So this is a case where you could argue that radio really was behind Spotify. Let's look at one of the album cuts, All the Good Girls Go to Hell. It debuts at number 8, but only stays there for 1 week, and then ends up only staying in the top 30 for 3 weeks. So you could make a logical statement that, this is an album cut, not a hit. But let's look at a song that radio never played, Billie Eilish's Wish You Were Gay. It moves up to number 3 when the entire album is released. And it doesn't stay top 10 for very long, only 2 weeks, but it does stay top 30 for 10 weeks. And you'll notice that even though this is not nearly as strong of a song as Bad Guy, I mean, clearly that's the big hit from the album, its decline also is much slower and looks more like some of our hit songs than it does our album cuts or otherwise songs that radio shouldn't have played. And this is without any radio airplay whatsoever. So you could potentially make an argument that this is a song that could have been a radio hit if we had made it one. Now let's talk about one of the other big artists of the year, Lizzo. And for the first time, we're going to see a different pattern develop on Spotify than the ones that we've seen so far when we examine Truth Hurts. Unlike the other songs that debuted big and then declined week after week, Truth Hurts slowly grew over time, peaking at number 5 in May. And then it seemed to be declining until it grew yet again, and ultimately has been top 10 for 21 weeks and counting, and top 30 for 23 weeks and counting. Well, why did it grow, and how does that growth compare to radio? Well, here are the Spotify positions for Truth Hurts, and now radio. Now, selected airplay started just a couple of weeks after it started growing on Spotify. But significant airplay really didn't start until about 7 weeks after the streaming had picked up. And then peak airplay came 6 weeks after peak Spotify streams. But notice that when the airplay picked up, that's when we see that second boost of streams and the song goes from declining to growing again. So on the one hand, radio may have been late to play Truth Hurts in mass, but on the other hand, when radio did start playing Truth Hurts, it added a second life of growth to the streaming for that song. And that's a trend we're going to see with several songs. Our next batch of songs are when radio airplay leads to Spotify streaming. And just to clarify, we're looking at correlation here, not causation. We cannot prove in court that radio caused songs to go on Spotify, but there is a pretty clear correlation to it. And so I think it's a fair conclusion to say that at least on some of those songs, radio helps develop it on Spotify. Typical pattern for country songs like Morgan Wallen's Whiskey Glasses. This song developed more like you'd expect it to develop on radio, slowly growing each week until it peaks and then slowly declines. And the radio airplay growth was actually ahead of the Spotify growth. Country stations started playing it about the same time the streaming started. Streaming picked up as airplay picked up for the song. And then Whiskey Glasses actually peaked on Spotify 2 weeks after it had already peaked in airplay. Not just limited to country. For Charlotte Rapper DaBaby, we see a similar trend where the Spotify growth parallels its growth in airplay on radio, with streaming picking up after the airplay starts. There are also cases where radio airplay kept people listening to Spotify for a long period of time. We want to focus in on the two of the biggest hits on radio, High Hopes and Halsey's Without Me. Panic at the Disco's High Hopes didn't really reach the top of Spotify, which is typical of rock and alternative material. It was only top 30 for 5 weeks. But notice that once it reached number 1 in radio airplay, that it peaked on Spotify, and then it really, in subsequent weeks, didn't really decline nearly as fast in streaming as we've seen for some other songs. So you could make an argument here that radio kept people going back to Spotify to hear that song. And we see a similar patterns with Halsey's Without Me, where once the song was number 1 on radio, it had already peaked on Spotify, but after that, it really didn't decline nearly as fast as some other songs did. So here we're seeing that radio may well be leading people to continue to stream songs for a much longer period of time. Now we're going to see a song that has a pattern that you'll never see in any other song, because it's certainly special for this song. It's, in fact, the biggest song on Spotify during the time period we examined, Post Malone's Sunflower. The song comes out declines, but then sees a huge surge once the movie itself comes out, is released nationwide, and the song goes #1 on Spotify. But then, long after it, performed very strong week after week, 44 weeks in the top 10, 49 weeks in the top 30. But then we see another boost, in this fall when Post Malone releases the album Hollywood Bleeding. Now, Sunflower is not on that Post Malone album. However, as people are sampling the new Post Malone album, it led to a week of increased streaming for older songs like Sunflower. And here again, we see that radio was right on top of adding Sunflower. It reaches airplay. Airplay reaches top 10 after 11 weeks. The only difference in the radio exposure of Sunflower versus Spotify is that, as you would expect, radio moved it to recurrent after 22 weeks, whereas it continued to remain in the top 10 on Spotify for many weeks thereafter. Now, you knew we couldn't do a presentation about music in 2019 without talking about this song, Lil Nas X, Old Town Road. And this is an interesting story of how you can break Billboard charts in 2019. Now, by the time the song showed up on Spotify, the Yeehaw Challenge thing had already happened on TikTok. It had already gotten some buzz. And while the song is growing on Spotify, is the point in time where it got a lot of PR for Billboard famously yanking it off the country charts when they realized it was a hip hop song, not a country song. That then leads to Billy Ray Cyrus doing a remix of the song, which instantly debuts at #1, right at the point in time where the original version of the song was #2 on Spotify. Now, that's the point that the song starts its record run at #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart. And as we discussed with Billie Eilish, even though Spotify considers them separate songs, Billboard considers them the same song. So if you added those together, Old Town Road would have been #1 on Spotify with both versions combined for a record 10 weeks. Then we get to that date I told you to remember, July 18th, 7/18. This is the point where Lil Nas X can see his record in his sights, but he sees that the song is dropping on Spotify. So they release yet another remix of the song. Added together, it gives them 2 more weeks at #1 on Spotify if Spotify had added them together the way Billboard does. And just to get him over the line, we then add yet another remix with Soul Town Road remix, which then ultimately gives him his record run as the #1 song. Billie Eilish at this time is also releasing remixes, trying to get Bad Guy to overtake it at #1, which it ultimately does after this run. And then the song goes back to running its kind of normal course as people stop listening to these new remixes. They bolster interest in the short term, but don't really stick around. In the end, the song is top 10 for 21 weeks, top 30 for 23 weeks. Now, how did radio do with embracing such a strange song as Old Town Road? Well, if you look at both versions of the song, significant airplay really didn't start till the Billy Ray Cyrus version came out. And so you could say that airplay was 5 weeks after it started on Spotify, and that peak airplay was 8 weeks after the Spotify peak streams. But arguably the real version of this song, the hit that everyone really thinks of, is the Billy Ray Cyrus remix. And if we just examine the streaming performance of the Billy Ray Cyrus remix version of Old Town Road, radio was right on time with adding that right when streaming started on it, and peak airplay was 8 weeks after Spotify streams peaked. So if you just look at that version, you could say radio was right on time with Old Town Road. Final song we're going to look at, pretty much most of the songs in Spotify's top 200 are contemporary songs. Either they're new songs or they're at least only a year or two old. However, there was one song that consistently generated around 2.2 million streams each week. It generally was around 109 on the Spotify charts, and it was a pretty old song, Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody. Now, you could say that this song probably got a lot of interest because of the Freddie Mercury movie that came out last year, but it may also stand a chance that people keep streaming it just because it's awesome. So, back to our question. Is Spotify changing new music consumption patterns? Well, no, fundamentally, we tend to see songs on Spotify that look like either the way people used to buy music or the way they hear it on radio, but it is giving us a much more detailed picture of how people consume new music, and we're getting a lot of more insight in what can lead people to play more music. And so some of the factors that we see that generates more streaming are when a big artist releases a new song, when a big artist releases a new album, even when the song has already been released, when there's a new remix of a big song that doesn't last long, but it can help, when a movie featuring a song is released, or when radio exposes a song. So those are the things that can lead to more streaming. Does radio need to change its pattern? In other words, is radio too late to add new songs? Well, generally no, but it depends. There are a lot of songs that radio was right on time with, from Ariana Grande to Post Malone to country to big pop hits, even Old Town Road. Arguably, radio hung on to Taylor Swift's Me too long, but we certainly were right on time with playing it. There are songs, though, that radio, statistically at least, was late to embracing. Most notably, Billie Eilish's Bad Guy. You could also make an argument that Wish You Were Gay potentially could have been a hit with radio support, neither here nor there. Same story with Lizzo's Truth Hurts. So with that in mind, what have we concluded by doing this deep dive of Spotify data that we think would be helpful to radio? Well, we've got 3 lessons we think radio can learn from Spotify. Number 1, find new ways to acknowledge new releases from big artists. Listeners care about new music from their favorite artists, and it's a big reason they use contemporary radio. Now, we may have all been led to believe that they didn't care, because when we saw PPM data through MScore, they were more likely to tune out when they heard new music compared to their old favorites. But then Shazam came along and reminded us, no, wait, people actually are willing to download an app for the specific purpose of finding out more information about new music. And now that we have Spotify data, we can see that some of the peaks in music consumption come when big artists release new songs and release new albums. Fewer listeners are thinking of radio as a place to discover new music. When we did our the Alexa Effect webinar earlier this year, we found that when we asked, where do you hear the latest new music first, among 15 to 19-year-olds, teenagers are more likely to say that it's from an on-demand audio service like Spotify or from YouTube than they are FM radio. And if you look at the ages where the majority still find out about new music first on radio, you have to look at 35-year-olds and older people to say that FM radio is still the dominant way they find out about new music. So even though we're exposing new music, we're not getting perceptual credit for it. And since people do indeed use contemporary radio stations because they want to stay on top of what's going on in the music they love, this is a perceptual problem. Continue to focus on the real hit from a new release, however. And the reason we say that is, some people have pondered that maybe radio needs to be playing every song from an album because they're seeing when songs debut that, wow, Ariana Grande has 9 of the top 10 songs, or Billie Eilish has 7 of the top 10 songs. Well, that's probably not any different than if we could have listened to people playing CDs 25 years ago, because when people buy a new CD or have access to a new album, they do want to sample everything on it if they're a big fan of that artist. But eventually, we see things settle down into 1 or 2 or 3 big hits from that project, just the way we always have. And importantly, get credit for the new music you play. We're not suggesting that radio needs to change their playlist and change their music strategy and add a whole bunch of new unfamiliar songs in rotations that are too low for anyone to get to know the songs. We still believe that if you're going to bet on a new song, bet big on it and give it enough exposure. But what we're saying is that radio needs to get perceptual credit for the new music it helps listeners discover, and that comes to things that you do in between the music. And finally, reinforce radio's value to labels to generate streaming. In the olden system, we didn't pay performance royalties, but we generated the sales. Well, now labels are looking at radio saying, well, if people are sampling our music on Spotify, we get a performance royalty whether they become a fan of the new artist or not. It's important for us to remind the record labels that even though Spotify might be the shiny new object in their world, that we're still a behemoth in the room that has tremendous power to help them generate revenue, even if it's through streaming these days, more so than it is physical sales. Lesson number 2 for radio. Use Spotify data comparably to how you once used sales data. Don't simply look at what's number 1 this week, because that can lead you to play some songs that are not going to have staying power. Instead, look for songs that remain big hits week after week. When songs fade fast on Spotify, consider dropping them. Spotify can give you a heads up that a song is, doesn't have staying power. And our third and final lesson is be strategic with songs that are big on Spotify. two of the songs that we picked on for radio being late to embrace were Billie Eilish's Bad Guy and Lizzo's Truth Hurts. But the reality is, it wasn't like radio just didn't know about these songs. Programmers did know about these songs. In many cases, they were playing them and they were testing them, and they were finding that listeners were not responding well to them overall. Well, if you dig into the research, the reason is these songs are polarizing. And if you listen to them, it makes a lot of sense. Both Eilish and Lizzo represent a new sound that is not quite like anything we've heard before. And so if you get back a ranker report in music research and see, wow, Lizzo's Truth Hurts was your bottom song, and you dig into it, you may discover that, well, that's because a lot of your listeners really love that song. They're like, wow, this is like nothing I've ever heard before. Well, on the other hand, you have other listeners who are listening going, ugh, that doesn't sound like anything I've ever heard before. And so what do you do when you have a song that's polarizing? Well, the challenge is for radio, those haters count in a way they don't for Spotify, because if someone hates the song you're playing, they're going to change the radio station. So that means you have to carefully weigh the value of those songs. Does the song appeal to your audience? Take someone like Billie Eilish, who it turns out really has strong appeal, specifically among women under age 25. But when you start getting to older listeners in their 30s and 40s, they're the ones most likely to say, I don't get her. Also, you have to look at, is this song strategic to your brand? If your brand is built upon being the hippest station in town that's always on top of new trends, you may need to play a buzzworthy artist like Billie Eilish, even if there's a segment of your audience that doesn't particularly like the song, just so that you can own the image of being hip. However, if you're a more conservative station, maybe an adult CHR, a hot AC, or even an AC station, you may be far less concerned about being hip, but far more concerned about being the station that people feel like everyone can agree on at work, and that you're the station that's always playing a familiar favorite. Well, if that's your brand, then maybe you're right to shy away from some of these big buzzworthy artists if they're going to be polarizing among your audience. So in just a second here, my colleague Becky is going to ask some questions for us. In the meantime, I know that one of the questions that's probably popping up here is, are we going to release the slide deck of this? We're not going to actually release the slide deck, but what we are going to do is have a video of this presentation that we will be more than happy to share with you once it's ready in the next few days, and we'll send you an email about that. Okay, Becky, do we have any questions so far?
Let's see. Well, we've got one question for you that is, you showed a song that was really big on radio, but you said it was only in Spotify's top 30 for a few weeks, and that radio helped keep it a hit.
Right.
How can you say it's a hit when it wasn't really in the top 30 very long?
So I think what they're talking about is some songs where it may have been like, for example, Whiskey Glasses, which was a country song, which overall on radio airplay, reached a pretty high level in the charts, but, really was not even breaking the top 50 on Spotify. And that's where I want to be careful that the purpose of this webinar is not to discuss which specific genres of music are more or less popular, because what we found is that the Spotify audience is different than the much larger radio audience. So what we find, for example, is that Spotify listeners tend to be younger, and hip hop fans in particular have coalesced around Spotify and other on-demand services as the way they hear hip hop. And a lot of the hip hop that gets consumed in the United States, at least, goes towards Spotify, whereas country fans, not only do they tend to be demographically broader, including more older people, but country fans are really big fans of radio, and they tend to consume a lot of country music on radio. So there are cases when you're looking at it genre by genre, you can't say that a country song isn't popular because it's not as popular as a hip hop song. You kind of have to look at Spotify and say, okay, we're going to compare the country songs to other country songs. We're going to compare the hip hop songs to other hip hop songs. And so that's probably why I was saying that a song was a big hit on Spotify. It wasn't necessarily a big hit compared to all of the hip hop songs or the Billie Eilish songs, but it was a big hit compared to other country songs on Spotify.
All right. Well, we've got another question for you. It says, based on Shazam popularity, should radio change the age-old tenet of forward momentum by not giving back cells and instead do back cells more often, disregarding the advice about forward momentum?
Ooh, a formatics question. I like it. I think that there's a lot of different ways to do formatics successfully. And I think what forward momentum is really about is the energy of the radio station. In other words, that age-old advice of, don't have the sense that we're stopping down and going to talk because we're going to lose that energy. You want to establish the next song is coming, and then before you have your jock talk over the intro. As you probably noticed, it's getting a lot harder to talk over intros because they're getting shorter and shorter. I think the key point here is no matter how you accomplish it formatically, that listeners want to find information about new music from you. And so whether it's that you have a stager that alerts a listener that we're going to be playing a brand new song from a core artist, whether it's that you have your air personalities sell it before a break, the main point is it's time to stop burying new music after a stop set that we jingle out of and don't even acknowledge that we're playing it, because what's happening is people are hearing new songs on radio, but because we're not acknowledging them, they're saying that they first heard them on Spotify. And so perception is a problem for radio. In just a second here,
Okay. We have another question. You touched on this a little bit about the whole situation about Lizzo, that radio was a little late to add it, and that people didn't feel like Call Out was really giving them good scores for it, and they didn't know what to do with it. Are you just supposed to follow Spotify and ignore your Call Out?
Absolutely not. Remember that what Spotify is going to show you is the number of times a particular song gets played among people who are using Spotify. It doesn't tell you any information about the demographics of those people. It's certainly not telling you local information beyond your country. And in the case of Lizzo specifically, what probably a lot of people were seeing in Call Out, and it varies from market to market, is probably when that song debuted, a lot of people were looking at it going, well, gee, this song is at the bottom of the ranker. Well, the reason it was at the bottom of the ranker is because we've had a lot of highly unusually polarizing songs this year, and Truth Hurts is a good example. It's a song that right off the bat, a lot of people love that song, but when a lot of people heard it for the first time, a lot of people really hated it. And so we're not saying that you should ignore your call out if your call out is saying, well, look, you're going to alienate a lot of listeners if you play this song. What we're saying is that, Spotify can give you an indication that this song is buzzworthy, and you need to then evaluate whether, factors beyond your call out, such as your brand and the buzz that this artist is generating, to make an educated decision of, can we afford to alienate those listeners long enough for maybe that they'll come around and realize this is the way music is going and that they'll like it? And do we need to be on top of that? Or are we going to be too hip for the room that is our audience if we embrace a song like that that's polarizing? So no, I would never say ignore your call out research if it's giving you but I would say dig deeper into it to try to get the full picture of, hey, if this song is testing at the bottom, is it just because it's super new and it hasn't had a chance to grow yet? Or is it because it's a song that is really polarizing and a lot of people love it, but a lot of people hate it? That's the kind of information you need to dig out from your research so that you can make an educated decision.
All right, and it looks like we have a question about, can you apply this advice to other countries beyond the U.S.?
We specifically analyze the United States, but and so when it comes to certain genres of music, there are probably some of the finer details of this presentation that are limited to the United States. In particular, we don't have research about the new music image for radio versus Spotify in other countries. But broadly speaking, in terms of how listeners consume music, I think it's fair to say that listeners in Germany or listeners in Bolivia who have access to Spotify are probably using it comparably to the way they would be listening in the United States. They may be listening to completely different genres of music, and they may have different perceptions of their local radio stations. But I think some of the big picture things you could apply to other countries.
All right, that sounds great. Do we have any more questions from anyone? Because otherwise, I think we might be finished with that.
All right. Well, as I mentioned, we are going to be sharing a video of this presentation for those of you who joined us late and want to see it again or want to share it with somebody. We'll have that for you. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, Matt Bailey, at integrateresearch.com, or you can join the conversation about this at our Facebook and Twitter as well. And thanks for joining us, and have a great day.